I thought that if NATO continued to move eastward and that we tried to incorporate Ukraine into NATO, it would lead to a conflict, and that ultimately Ukraine would be destroyed. Unfortunately, the United States, after 2014, when the crisis first broke out, continued to push forward with NATO expansion into Ukraine. And then this February, it all blew up in our face. The Russians have made it clear that if Ukraine exercises its so-called right, they will move in to prevent Ukraine from becoming part of NATO. The Russians have their own Monroe Doctrine. It's very interesting that Americans don't understand this. If the Chinese in 20 years were to put military forces in Canada or military forces in Mexico, the United States would
Jamaica
go ballistic.
Even.
This is unacceptable. If we don't want another great power putting its military forces on our border, are you surprised that the Russians don't want a military alliance that was a mortal foe of the Soviet Union during the Cold War on their border? Of course not. It makes perfect sense. People will say that your arguments, my arguments, are arguments that are designed to clear Putin's reputation, to protect Putin, and that I'm rooting for the Russians, and that I'm anti-Ukrainian, and so forth and so on. None of this is true. The reason that people make these arguments is because they can't beat me with facts and logic. The fact is, there's no evidence that Vladimir Putin was interested in conquering Ukraine and making it part of Russia. Hungarians, in my opinion, clearly understand that it's more important to maintain good relations with the Americans, first and foremost, but nevertheless you want to maintain good relations with the Russians. But the problem is it's very hard for Hungary to do that because the Americans have decided to basically go to war against the Russians.
So you don't have a miracle drug or a rabbit in the hat for
I don't.
What can you recommend for small countries like Hungary? What are a small country's chances of surviving on the world stage? Okay, so here we are once again with the Political Hobbyist. This is the second half of our program. We still have on the night here Adam Varga, Matyi Kohan, and Gav Duncan. And as you may know, or probably you don't, but I used to spend a lot of time in the music business. In fact, 25 years of my life were spent in there.
That's why the headphones are on.
They just stuck to me. I can't get rid of them.
I didn't spend 25 years in the music business. Why are they stuck to my head? Okay. We can talk about that later.
I've done interviews with quite a number of people, from Alice Cooper to Steven Tyler and John Bon Jovi. So I'm used to being in the presence of rock stars. But today we have a rock star beyond them all, Mr. John Mearsheimer from Chicago University. Welcome to Hungary. And I seriously mean, like, the guys in Wayne's World when they were bowing in front of Alice Cooper. It's like, oh, we're not worthy. We're little pieces of shit.
That was Aerosmith.
What?
That was Aerosmith.
No, that was Alice Cooper.
No.
Are you sure?
Check the film.
God,
it was Aerosmith.
It was such a long time ago. But anyway, Mr. Mearsheimer, thank you for coming, and thank you for taking the time to speak to us about whatever's going on in the world, which is a lot. And you have a video with over 28 million views on YouTube. It's called "Why the Ukraine is the West's Fault," and it's a wonderful video. And with your, let's say, I didn't ask permission, but I hope you don't mind that I've used a lot of the information in that video to do one of my own. That only has 60,000 viewers, but it's in Hungarian, and a lot of it, it's gotten really good reviews. Because whatever you said in that video, was that 5, 6, 7 years ago, I think?
2015.
2015, so 7 years ago, was just so much spot on. And Hungarians, of course, haven't seen it, and I tried to explain it to them what happened since then. And it's mind-blowing how much of what you said in 2015, without saying you were predicting it, but it has all come true. Hasn't it? Aren't you amazed yourself that all all your, let's say, quite pessimistic predictions have come true?
I'm depressed to say that they did come true for the most part. I thought that if NATO continued to move eastward and that we tried to incorporate Ukraine into NATO, it would lead to a conflict, and that ultimately Ukraine would be destroyed. Unfortunately, the United States, after 2014, when the crisis first broke out, continued to push forward with NATO expansion into Ukraine. And then this February, it all blew up in our face, and you had, or you have, a major war.
I mean, your video is about an hour long. Mine is an hour and a half because I include clips from when Biden spent some time in Ukraine and was bragging about how they were controlling elements of the Ukrainian government, when John McCain and Lindsey Graham were with the Ukrainian army, encouraging them to fight against the Russians. We're talking 2016. So I think it's really worth it for people to watch your video in English. You can watch it if you click here, or if you want to watch mine in Hungarian, you can also click here. But is there like a 5-minute version? Is it possible to just put it all together in 5 minutes on why this war has broken out and why this war has no end in sight?
Well, the United States mainly, but the United States or the West more generally, decided in about 2008 that they were going to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And this meant three things. First, and most importantly, including Ukraine in NATO. Second, including Ukraine in the European Union. And third, fostering an orange revolution in Ukraine that turned it into a pro-Western liberal democracy. The Russians made it clear in April 2008, when we said, NATO said, that Ukraine would become part of NATO, that was categorically unacceptable. The Russians made it clear at the time, this is not going to happen. And of course, what then occurs in February of 2014 is that a crisis finally breaks out between Ukraine and Russia. And this crisis is precipitated in large part by the West's efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark. What does the United States do? The United States and its allies double down, and they continue to push harder to bring Ukraine into NATO, into the EU, and to foster liberal democracy in Ukraine. The Russians have made it clear that Ukraine and NATO is the brightest of red lines. This is not going to happen. Joe Biden then becomes president in January of 2021. Joe Biden begins to push even harder than Donald Trump did to bring Ukraine into NATO. And then on February 24th of this year, the Russians said enough is enough, and they invade Ukraine, and we're now in the midst of a major war. But the key point that I made back then, and I continue to make, is that Vladimir Putin was not an imperialist who was bent on creating a greater Russia. He was not interested in conquering Ukraine to make it part of a greater Russia or to reconstruct the former Soviet Union. He was not an imperialist. What Putin was doing was he was reacting against the West's efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And the most important element in the West strategy, which scared Putin the most, was NATO expansion into Ukraine.
There is the counter argument to this. Two things come to my mind from what you just said. One of them is this, that the counter argument is that why would not Ukraine have the right to decide what they want to do? Why do we have to accept the fact that Russia is a great power next to Ukraine? Why can't they decide for themselves? That's one of the counter arguments. And the other thing that comes to my mind is what you just said about how the West, NATO, and the US is to blame, and that's dangerous enough territory for a man to walk on. But adding that Putin is not an imperialist, you are now a Russian asset. You are now a spy for Russia. You are now unwanted in Poland, if I'm correct, and in all the other civilized parts of the world. I mean, you're walking on dangerous ground from a personal standpoint, whether or not you're right, and I think you're completely right. But the common wisdom in the West, the media, what people talk, they don't accept this opinion. It's not just not accepted; it is a bad opinion. It's to be. You can't have this opinion.
Morally inferior.
It's immoral, yes.
Yeah. Let me answer your questions in sequence. The first is the argument that Ukraine has a right to join NATO. It's a sovereign state. It can have its own foreign policy. The problem with that argument is the Russians don't think the Ukrainians have that right because it threatens the security of Russia. And the Russians have made it clear that if Ukraine exercises its so-called right, they will move in to prevent Ukraine from becoming part of NATO. So
they have their own Monroe Doctrine.
That's exactly right. The Russians have their own Monroe Doctrine. It's very interesting that Americans don't understand this because we in the Western Hemisphere, we Americans in the Western Hemisphere, do not believe that other countries have the right to invite foreign great powers into the Western Hemisphere. This is the Monroe Doctrine. When the Soviets put missiles in Cuba in 1962, President Kennedy told Nikita Khrushchev in no uncertain terms those missiles had to leave Cuba. We were not going to tolerate foreign military forces on Cuban territory. This was in the Western Hemisphere. This was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. If the Chinese in 20 years would have put military forces in Canada or military forces in Mexico, the United States would
Jamaica
go ballistic.
Even.
This is unacceptable. This is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Well, as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we don't want another great power putting its military forces on our border, are you surprised that the Russians don't want a military alliance that was a mortal foe of the Soviet Union during the Cold War on their border? Of course not. It makes perfect sense. So the Russians said, we don't think you have the right. We're more powerful than you, and we're going to go to great lengths to wreck your country before we let it join, before we let you join NATO. So
that's what they're doing.
That's what they're doing. So talking about rights and Ukraine's right to join NATO.
It's a nice philosophical discussion, but in reality, it's irrelevant, I guess.
It's, by the way, a very liberal way of thinking about international politics. And what you're talking about here are rights, and your belief is that states have rights. And I've long believed that talking about international politics in liberal terms invariably gets you into trouble, because realpolitik is what describes how the world really works, or explains how the world really works. And for a state like Ukraine, it behooves that state to behave according to the dictates of realpolitik and not to antagonize the Russians. And I say that for the benefit of the Ukrainians. If you antagonize the Russians and you give them an incentive to wreck your country, this makes absolutely no sense. So I think talking about rights doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, your second question has to do with the argument I make that Putin was not an imperialist. And your point is, of course, if you make this argument in the West,
you're dead.
you're in big trouble.
Academically, at least.
Yeah, you're accused of being a Putin supporter, a Putin puppet, or something like that, unpatriotic, and so forth and so on. I learned when I was a little boy that when people can't beat you with facts and logic, what they do is they call you names. Yeah. And that's what's happening here. People will say that your arguments, my arguments, are arguments that are designed to clear Putin's reputation, to protect Putin, and that I'm rooting for the Russians, and that I'm anti-Ukrainian, and so forth and so on. None of this is true, right? And again, the reason that people make these arguments is because they can't beat me with facts and logic. The fact is, there's no evidence that Vladimir Putin was interested in conquering Ukraine and making it part of Russia. Nobody can point to any
not
evidence.
even, and I'm playing devil's advocate here. Not even the fact that he explicitly said in one of his speeches not so long ago, can't remember when it was, but it was within the last 2 years, that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the 20th century's biggest tragedy for Russia.
Yes, but he made it very clear that there was no way that the Soviet Union could be put back together, and that anyone who thought the Soviet Union could be put back together didn't have a brain. He said that he could understand how people in their heart would want to bring back the Soviet Union, but not in their head. It was not doable. He's not interested in bringing back the Soviet Union, and moreover, he was not interested in creating a greater Russia. The idea that Ukraine was just the first of a number of countries that Russia was going to conquer and incorporate into Ukraine for the purposes of making a greater Russia is unsupported by the evidence. You can't find evidence of Putin saying that. And if you don't like that argument, then there's the fact that the Russians didn't have the military capability. The Russians have not attempted to conquer all of Ukraine. They have not even attempted to conquer one half of Ukraine.
Well, they bombed Kiev, the capital, in the first stage of the war.
But bombing is different than conquering and occupying. You can bomb from the air, but you can't occupy. You can't conquer from the air.
As many of the American adventures have shown.
Yes, you have to conquer with ground forces. And by all accounts, the Russians went into Ukraine with at most 190,000 troops. 190,000 troops.
Against 350,000 Ukrainian troops.
But there's no way, given those numbers, no way that the Russians can conquer all of Ukraine. As I like to point out, when the Germans went into Poland on September 1st, 1939, they had an army that had 1.5 million men in it. 1.5 million. And additionally, the Soviet Union was scheduled to invade Poland 2.5 weeks later from the rear. So not only were the Germans going in the front door, the Soviets were coming in the back door. The Germans nevertheless went in with 1.5 million troops. Poland is a smaller country geographically and population-wise than Ukraine. And the Russians went in with 190,000 troops at the most. You're not going to conquer, occupy, and integrate into Russia, a country the size of Ukraine, with a small force like that.
To put another shameless plug in there, I actually made another video about why it is completely nonsense that Putin would invade Hungary or other countries in Europe. And it's also in Hungarian, but I'm kind of inclined to at least put English subtitles on it so that most of these wonderful viewers will understand it. But getting back to the first thing that we talked about is the realism that is, it's there. It's the elephant in the room, but most people, at least in the West, are not willing to accept or see that elephant in the room, and that you call yourself a realistic, and you talked about realpolitik, which is not very popular in the Western, in the liberal world, because. And tell me why it's so unpopular. I mean, logically, one would think that people want to see things for what they are, because if we look at things the way they are, then we can make reasonable assessments and then make reasonable decisions based on those facts. Whereas if we live in a wonderland or world of wishful thinking, and the liberal world in the West is turning more and more into this some utopistic kind of. Wonderland. Why are people so inclined to accept the liberal view more than the realistic one? So, I mean, it's not just a little more, it's millions of light years apart.
Well, first of all, we have to talk about realism. First of all, we have to talk about liberalism, and then second, talk about realism. Just with regard to liberalism, the United States is a profoundly liberal country. It just is. It's profoundly liberal. It tends to think of its own politics in liberal terms, and it tends to see the world through a liberal lens. And what the United States would like to do, ideally, is turn every country into a liberal democracy. It would like to remake the world in its own image, if it could.
Would that be a bad thing?
Yes, because it wouldn't happen. And the fact is that the world is made up of all these different nation states that view themselves as sovereign, and they don't want the United States telling them what their political order should look like. This is what got the Americans in trouble during the unipolar moment. As you all know, the Cold War ends in 1989, and then the Soviet Union collapses in December 1991, and the United States is by far the most powerful state on the planet. It is the unipolar moment. And you have this unipole that is thoroughly liberal. And what it does is it decides that it is going to try to remake the world in its own image. It's going to try to spread liberal democracy into countries like Hungary. And if Hungary says, we don't want to be a liberal democracy, we prefer to be an illiberal democracy, the United States is going to be very angry and go to great lengths to get Hungary to change its thinking.
Which kind of goes against the basic idea of liberalism.
Absolutely.
There's a contradiction here.
Yes, I think you could make an argument that it is actually an illiberal foreign policy, because liberalism is predicated on the assumption that individuals cannot agree on first principles. And liberalism is all about giving individuals room to live the good life the way they see fit. And if you live the good life one way and I live it a different way, I'm tolerant of how you live and you're tolerant of how I live. This is how liberalism works. Again, very important to understand that liberalism is predicated on the assumption that individuals cannot agree on first principles. And therefore, you have to give them room to act according to their own first principles, and you have to be tolerant of other people operating in ways that are different than the ways you operate. Well, if you take that to the nation-state level, you have to accept the fact that nation-states prefer different kinds of political orders, they have different cultures, they act in different ways, and that you must be tolerant of those differences. But in fact, liberal hegemony, which was our foreign policy during the unipolar moment, said there's one way to do business, our way. It's either our way or the highway, right?
I think
and in effect, you have what is not a very tolerant foreign policy. And as you point out, I think quite correctly, it is in a very important way illiberal.
I think it comes from probably from Karl Popper, a philosopher who I'm not really, let's say he's not my favorite. And I just quote, he stated, in order to maintain a tolerant society, the society must be intolerant to intolerance. And basically what the left does these days, they label intolerance everything they don't like, and they start an unholy war against it. Basically, this is how the left orders it. And how can we combat against this? How can we turn this around if we can?
Well, I think there's no question that if you create a liberal society, you constantly worry about illiberal forces in that society, because those illiberal forces may damage and ultimately undermine your liberal society. Right?
Because the way I say that this neoliberal try to create a so-called perfect society, but can this perfect society be maintained without a strong dictatorship? Because I believe it cannot, because the society cannot be perfect because people are not perfect.
Yeah, that's the problem. In order to eliminate these illiberal elements in a liberal society that you just said, you have to be illiberal. You have to eradicate them, and then you do everything that's the opposite of what your principles are.
Well, the question is, how significant are those illiberal elements inside of a liberal society? If they're small in number and not very powerful, this is not a problem. What happens if you have a liberal society and you have large numbers of groups in that society that are dissatisfied with liberalism, then liberalism has to act the way you're describing to deal with those threats, and the end result is you get an liberal state, if I can mix up the language. So I don't deny that that's a possibility, right? And again, as I said to begin with, liberal states are constantly worried about threats from within. And you also don't want to forget the fact that they're worried about threats from outside. Remember, liberal Woodrow Wilson, a canonical liberal, talked about making the world safe for democracy. What exactly was Wilson talking about? Wilson was saying, we want to create a world, right, that is safe for liberal democracies, where you don't have fascist states or communist states that would threaten the liberal states. And this is the argument that what you want to do is you want to create a planet that's populated with nothing but liberal democracies.
So you need an army for that, a huge army, and that's not very liberal.
Well, the problem there, and this is the problem that liberal hegemony ran into, is that you create, right, an army or a military, and then you run around the world trying to do social engineering, trying to turn states that are not liberal democracies into liberal democracies. But what you do then is you run into nationalism. And my argument is that nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. And when you try to do social engineering, when you try to go into countries and change their political system, you're violating their sovereignty. You're violating the principle of self-determination, and you run into a lot of trouble. Hungarians do not like the idea of people in Brussels or people in Washington tell them what their politics should look like. This is nationalism at play.
And this is not even extreme nationalism, and we're not using nationalism in a negative way.
Absolutely. I'm using nationalism as a rather neutral term. Nation states embody nationalism. And nation states are interested in maintaining their own sovereignty. Even liberal America is interested in maintaining its own sovereignty. Remember, there were all these reports, I think they were basically false, but there were these reports that the Russians had interfered in the 2016 election, and the only reason that Trump won and Clinton lost was because the Russians interfered. Whether that's true or not, and I don't think it's true, let's just assume it's true. The American public was outraged that a foreign government was interfering in American politics. It was a violation of our sovereignty. Well, that same logic works in the opposite direction when the United States, as the unipole, runs around the world interfering in the politics of other countries and trying to change their politics.
When the ambassador of the United States to a country orders judges from that country to visit him and tell them basically how the judicial system should work. I'm just saying that out of
no specific
example. Yes, it just happened here in Budapest a couple of weeks ago.
Right, but this is an example of a liberal foreign policy clashing with nationalism. And this is what happens when the Americans invade Afghanistan. This is what happened when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. When I was a young boy and then a young man and in the American military, this is what happened in the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese did not want the United States of America telling them what their politics should look like. They wanted to create a sovereign Vietnam. They wanted to unite North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and they believed in self-determination, and they were willing to fight and die in huge numbers to prevent us from staying in Vietnam and doing social engineering.
Okay, so the problem is, and this is the problem in general with your theories, with your standpoint of realism, is that if we have illiberal states, and I don't mean illiberal democracies, but let's say authoritarian states who are a danger to the free world because of their willingness to conquer whatever, and in order to protect the free world from those rash states, so to speak, the free world will push forward its agenda and try to first convince and then force other countries to live by its standards, and the clash is imminent. And this all looks really hopeless because then of course we don't want authoritarian systems. for ourselves, but we also don't want liberal systems forced upon people who want to live differently and then create wars because of this. But it happens, and this is, like I said, that's the general problem or hardship with your theory, is that it's hopeless. There is no hope in my view. Can you, at least a little, be an optimist?
Well, it's very hard to be an optimist given my realist view of the world. I believe the great powers compete among themselves for power, in large part because the best way to protect yourself in a world where there's no higher authority that can rescue you is to be really powerful. It's to be the biggest state in your region of the world, if not on the entire planet. The problem that Hungary has is that it has only 10 million people. If there were 400 million Hungarians, and Hungary was by far the most powerful state in Europe, and indeed was the most powerful state on the planet, for purposes of security, of survival, Hungary would be much better off than it is today with a population of 10 million. Hungary is a small state that has to constantly worry about being devoured by larger states. So the basic message I have is that if you're powerful and you have the means to accumulate more power, you should look for opportunities to do that. You should look for opportunities as a great power to become even more powerful, because that's the best way to survive in a system where there is no higher authority that can rescue you if you get into trouble, and you can never be secure, or you can never be certain about the intentions of other states.
Okay, well, there's one higher authority, and that's God, but that's a different matter. But okay, your suggestion works perfectly well for great powers like the U.S. or China, which we haven't talked about much today yet, but we don't even have time for it. But what can you recommend for small countries like Hungary? What are a small country's chances of surviving on the world stage in this realistic
Well, I
viewpoint?
think there's no question that a country like Hungary is in a remarkably difficult situation, because it has to worry about the Russians on one side and the Americans on the other side. If you just talk about Hungarian security, the Hungarians I've talked to fully understand the importance of having good relations with the United States, keeping the United States in Europe, and keeping NATO intact, because that provides security for Hungary. Hungary is glad it's in NATO. It would like NATO to remain intact. At the same time, the Hungarians understand that Russia is a potential threat, and that a war in Ukraine involving Russia is likely to be disastrous for Hungary.
But not because Russia would invade Hungary, but for other reasons, because we just talked that
a war breaks out in Hungary in February of this past year, and it has already had significant negative economic consequences for Hungary. Those negative consequences are likely to get greater and greater over time. Furthermore, there's a possibility that war in Ukraine involving Russia could escalate to the nuclear level. And if it escalates to the nuclear level, nuclear weapons could be used in Western Ukraine, and you could have all sorts of fallout in Hungary. This is certainly not in Hungary's interest. It's also possible that the United States could get dragged into the war in Ukraine, and then you would have a great power war between between the United States and Russia, which would be a disaster for Hungary, right? So Hungary, in a very important way, is trying to maneuver between the Russians and the United States, and to maintain good relations with both sides. And the Hungarians, in my opinion, clearly understand that it's more important to maintain good relations with the Americans first and foremost, but nevertheless you want to maintain good relations with the Russians. But the problem is it's very hard for Hungary to do that, because the Americans have decided to basically go to war against the Russians. So the Hungarians are caught in the middle. and they don't have a lot of power, and therefore they don't have a lot of leverage over the Americans.
So you don't have a miracle drug or a rabbit in the hat for
I
us?
don't.
Apparently not. So on that very pessimistic note, we must finish. I don't even want to go on any further. It's like the Suicide Song, which incidentally is written by a Hungarian, Rezső Seres, and I heard one time about a musical expert about how that song is about. It expresses total hopelessness, the way the song is structured, that at the end there is no solution but suicide. So I don't want to go any further down the line. Mr. Mearsheimer, thank you very much for giving us your not very optimistic but still very, very clear and realistic opinions. Thank you for coming, and for the viewers, thank you also for watching us. This was this installment of The Political Hobbyist. Don't forget to watch the first one we did 2 years ago with Rod Dreher. You can click right here and watch it. He was very, very interesting, and he had some really great insight, and God knows when we're going to do the next one, but we are going to do it. Thank you. Bye.